designing a distinctive brand. So when we talk about design in the context of branding, what exactly are we talking about? So usually what comes to mind is the logo or picking your colors, picking your favorite colors. But that's not really what we're talking about in the context of branding. So when it comes to design in the context of branding, we're not just talking about the logo. We're not just talking about picking your favorite colors. So what we're talking about is really expressing the vision and the essence behind your brand in a way that's memorable, in a way that's impactful, and in a way that really resonates with the target audience that we're trying to speak to. Because that's the ultimate goal, because it has to resonate with people. It has to draw their attention. It has to engage them. So that's what we're trying to do here is we're trying to really design a distinctive brand that really resonates with the people that we're trying to speak to. So many years ago, if you wanted to launch a business, so before you could just get a logo and just have it printed on different items. But that old method doesn't work anymore because the world has become much more complicated. And the way that customers interact with their favorite brands has become much more complex. So it's no longer just enough to just print your logo on different items. So we have to be more strategic about how we approach design and how we approach branding. So it's more about how can we leverage more design more effectively to really speak to the target audience that we're trying to reach. So it's more about leveraging design more effectively to really create the right perception, the right experience that draws our customers in. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about designing a distinctive brand. It's more about really creating an experience and creating the right perception, based on who we are as a company and how we want to be perceived in the industry. Okay, so it all boils down to your brand's identity. So what exactly is a brand identity? So your brand's identity, it could be seen as a visual expression of your brand. So it could be visual, it could be verbal, or it could be auditory. So it's all about how your brand is being expressed. That's your visual identity. It's an expression of your brand. So think about if your brand was a person. So when you look at me, how do you identify me? Number one, you identify me based on what you see, number one. Secondly, is based on what you hear. And thirdly, could be maybe what you read when you read my blog articles. All these things would help you to identify me and who I am. So that's the same with your company. So it's kind of like a person. So we're trying to create a distinct identity that really speak to the audience that we're trying to address. So your brand's identity, it could be described, so it's the visual, the verbal, and the auditory expression of the brand. So it's not just about the logo, it could also be verbal, and it could also be through the auditory senses. So what images come to mind when people think about your brand? Or how would you describe your brand's tone when they read your marketing copy? How do you want to sound? And also, what kinds of sounds come to mind when people think about your brand? So all these things help come together to make your brand much more distinct, much more recognizable, much more memorable. So that's what a brand identity is. It's just the like, how your brand is being expressed to speak to the target customers. Okay, so now that we know what a brand identity is, what makes a strong brand identity? So how can we tell if the brand's identity is effective enough, is strong enough? So one key factor that makes a strong brand identity is that it has to be authentic. So your brand's identity, it has to be an authentic expression of who you are as a company. So it shouldn't seem like you're trying to be something else or like you're trying to be what you're not. It has to be really authentic to what your company is all about. Secondly, is memorability. So, because you're going to be putting a lot of effort into marketing. So, you wouldn't want to have a situation in which you spend lots of money on marketing and no one can remember your brand. So, your brand's identity, it has to be memorable. People have to be able to recognize it when they see it. It has to be memorable so that way they can also talk about it as well. The third thing that makes a strong brand identity is coherence. Coherence. So what does coherence mean? So a brand is similar to a mosaic or a puzzle. So there are all these different parts that come together to shape the overall experience that your customers have, to shape the perception sometimes we call this your story. So all these different parts come together to shape the overall narrative of what your brand is all about. So everything needs to work together. Everything needs to tie in with what you're all about and who you are as a company. So that's what we mean when we talk about brand coherence, is that all these different pieces needs to come together to shape the overall picture that we're trying to that we're trying to paint, because ultimately we're trying to paint a picture in our customers' minds, and all these different parts come together to create that image. Okay, the third thing that makes a strong brand identity is differentiation. So that this is one of the main goals, is that we just want to stand out from the competition. We want to be different from all the others. So differentiation is it's a powerful thing both from a marketing point of view and also from a legal point of view. Because if other people, if you have a brand's identity that other companies are already using, then that can put your company in huge trouble if other people have already trademarked the same logo, if other companies have already trademarked the same name, the same tagline, the same symbols. So that can put you in huge trouble. So ultimately, we're trying to create a brand identity that's very different from all the others. So we're trying to stand out from the competition as much as possible. Okay, the third key to a strong brand identity is that you have to have that emotional appeal, because ultimately we're trying to really connect with people. So we have to really resonate with the target audience. So when people come across your brand, it's really important to think of, how do you want people to feel when they come across this brand? How do we want them to feel? What's the emotional experience that would describe our products, our services? So you have to speak to the emotions, because most purchasing decisions, they're actually driven by emotions. So our brand, it needs to speak to the emotions and have that emotional appeal, that wow moment, so that when they come across our brand for the first time, it has to draw them in, make them say wow. It has to have a very positive sentiment. Okay, the next key to a strong brand identity is flexibility, because your customers, you're going to be coming across your brand through a variety of different channels. So your brand's identity, it has to be flexible enough to work through all the different ways that customers find you, both online and offline. So for example, it has to work well on your website. It has to work on uniforms. It has to work on your office signage. So everything, it has to be flexible enough to work in a variety of different channels, whether it's your website, whether it's your brochures, your business card, it needs to be flexible enough to work. And that's what makes a strong brand identity. And lastly, is that it has to evolve. So the best brand identities are able to evolve over time. So when it comes to your brand's identity, it's not something that's static. It's not something that you do once. So it has to evolve over time. So as your company evolves, your brand identity also needs to evolve over time to keep up with the changing world. So here's an example of the Starbucks logo. So you can see how the Starbucks logo has evolved over time. So if Starbucks was still using the same logo from the 1970s, then it probably wouldn't work today in today's world, because that's a very old logo. It looks very old, very dusty. So it probably wouldn't work today. So over time, they have to improve their logo and refine their logo so that it could speak to the customers of today. So I usually recommend revamping your brand's identity every 7 to 10 years to keep it modern, to keep it fresh, so that way it stays strong, it stays relevant in the industry. Okay, so notice how Starbucks, their logo evolved over time, but they still preserved the things that customers love the most. Because if your logo looks too different, then that can cause people to not recognize it anymore. So the challenge is to be able to evolve your logo while still preserving the things that customers love the most, the things that people use to identify it. So that's what makes a strong brand identity, is that number one, it has to be authentic to who you are as a company. It has to be memorable. People have to recognize it and remember it when they see it. Thirdly, is coherence. So the best brand identities, they're not just focused on just the logo. They're made up of many different parts that come together. So all these parts have to come together to shape the overall experience. That's what we mean by coherence. Next is differentiation. So it has to be different from all the others. Also, it needs to have that emotional appeal. It has to connect with people emotionally, make them say, wow. Next, it has to be flexible enough to work, whether it's on your website or your business cards or your brochures, on your signage. It has to be flexible enough. And lastly, is evolving. So it has to be able to evolve over time. And that's what makes a strong brand identity. Okay. So before developing your brand's identity, there are certain steps that you need to take. There are certain prerequisites. So before you begin developing your brand's identity, you need to first do a SWOT analysis to really understand where you currently are in your business. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So first you need to look at what are my key strengths in my business? What areas are my strongest? It could also be in terms of how customers perceive you. So what are your current strengths? What do customers currently love the most about your brand? The next thing to consider is the weaknesses. So what areas are you currently weak? What areas could your business improve? What areas could use more funding? Next is the opportunities. So when you look at where your industry is heading and where the world is heading, you might find some opportunities that you can leverage. So what opportunities can you leverage in your business to give you a competitive advantage? And next is threats. So what future threats may exist in your industry that could have a direct impact on your business? So by doing a SWOT analysis, that can give you a clearer picture of where you currently are in your business before you begin developing your brand's identity. Next is to clarify your business goals. So you need to gain more clarity on what your goals are because the work that's done needs to align with your business goals. We have to align your brand with your business goals. So where exactly are you looking to take this business? For example, if you plan to expand into other products, other areas, then that could also affect your brand's identity. So you need to consider your longer term goals and your short term goals. So, for example, do you plan to expand into other areas? Do you plan to expand into other countries? Do you plan to change your business name? All these things would have a direct impact on your brand's identity. So they need to be addressed up front. The next thing to consider is the competition. So it's really important to gain a clearer picture of the competitive landscape. So who are the other players in your industry? So you probably have hundreds, if not thousands of competitors, but you don't have to know every single person. You just need to analyze maybe like 7 people or 10 people just to gain a clearer picture of what other people are doing. Because ultimately, we're trying to stand out from the competition. So we have to consider the other people in the industry. Next is a target audience. So it's really important to gain a clearer picture of the customers that we're trying to reach. So how would you describe the target audience? Because the brand's identity needs to resonate with these people. So we have to gain a much deeper understanding of the target audience that we're trying to speak to. It's also about understanding how they perceive your brand as well. So maybe, for example, your customers already love your current logo. In that case, then if you change it, that can cause you to lose sales. So it's really important to understand your customers and also how they perceive your current brand, because that will really affect how you approach the brand's identity, how you approach everything. So these are the 4 prerequisites. The next step is to identify the touch points. So you need to, so this can be seen as an extension of your marketing plan. So you need to really identify all the different touch points, all the different ways that customers would interact with your brand or find you, whether it's online or offline. Because like I said earlier, the way customers interact with brands is more complex than ever. For example, you have the rise of podcasting, you have the rise of social media. So there are so many different channels, and all these things makes your brand much more complex. So you need to really identify all the different ways that customers would interact with your brand, so that way we can develop an identity that works effectively across all these different touch points, whether it's a website, whether it's a retail environment, whether it's an office space. So there are so many different channels. So all these things need to be clarified up front. What are the ways that customers would find you, whether it's online or offline? Okay, so now that you've identified all the different touch points, the next step is to develop your brand identity. So here are the steps to develop a unique brand identity. So the first step is to audit the competition. So earlier we spoke about competitive analysis, but now we're just talking about an audit. So at this point, we're just looking at the marketing materials of your competitors. So for example, we might look at your competitors' websites, their social media presence, their advertisements. So by auditing the competition, that would give you a better idea of how other people are communicating because we don't want to sound like everyone else. We don't want to look like everyone else. So by auditing the competition, that would give us a clear idea of what other people are doing so that we could stand out from all the others. Okay. The next step is to define your brand's persona. So your brand's persona can be described as the traits that customers would love the most about your brand. So let's say, for example, your brand was a person, because people connect with people. So if we're trying to connect with customers, then our brand needs to have certain traits that customers would love the most. So at this point, we're trying to define what those traits are so that we can express these traits in a more effective way through design, through messaging. So the brand's persona is really complex. There are different parts that make it up. But I just want you to have a quick overview of what a brand's persona is. It could also include your core values, the core values that customers love the most about your brand. So all these things help to shape the way people perceive your company as a whole. Okay, so after you've defined your brand's persona, the next step is to develop the key messages. So at this point, we might develop your tagline. This could be your tagline or your campaign slogan. So everything will need to align with your brand's persona and the perception, how you want people to perceive you. So your key messages, it could also include the name of your company. It could include your story, the story behind it, because everything will need to align with the key messages that we're trying to convey. And then after that, the next step is to express your brand. So now that we've clarified the competition, we've developed the key messages and the brand's persona, we can now begin to express the brand visually using design. Okay, so when it comes to expressing your brand, there are five main goals of design and branding. So there are five main goals of design. So when we talk about design in the context of branding, we're not just talking about what we like or what we don't like. We're not just talking about making things pretty. So there are five main goals of design and branding. So ultimately, we're trying to create an experience, and that experience that we're trying to create, it needs to create and build trust. So trust is the ultimate goal. So we want customers to feel like they can trust us. We want to look like a legitimate company that customers could trust. So trust is one of the main goals because customers, they're much less likely to buy from a brand that they don't trust. So trust is a crucial factor today because many of your customers, they have been burnt in the past. They have been scammed in the past. They have been told lies by other companies. So nowadays, we have to work extra hard to build that trust. And the more customers see your brand, the more trust that they would feel about it. So in psychology, we call this the mere exposure effect. So the more customers see your brand, the more trust they would feel. So your brand, it needs to look trustworthy so that the more they see it in your marketing, the more trust they would feel. The second main goal is identification. So we just want customers to say that's who we are. So when they see us, they can identify us. So it's pretty simple. The third main goal is differentiation. So we're trying to differentiate our company from all the others. We want our company to be as different as possible from all the others. So differentiation, like I said earlier, it's really important from a marketing point of view and also from a legal point of view because we don't want to use a symbol that other companies have trademarked. So it has to be different because we don't want to fall into any legal issues down the road. The next main goal is association. So association is really powerful because most purchasing decisions are actually driven by the subconscious, the things that people associate with our brand. So we want people to associate certain things with our company. So that's the main goal is association. So we're trying to, so if you don't determine what we want customers to associate with our brand, then what happens is our customers would have these false perceptions about who we are. So we have to be really clear about who we are and what we want people to associate with our brand. And all these things need to be communicated through our marketing. And lastly, is connection, because ultimately we just want to connect with customers. We want them to connect with our brand, to engage with us. We want them to feel more positively about it. So our brand, it needs to have that emotional connection. We're trying to create that connection with our customers so that they can buy from us. So these are the five main goals: is trust, identification, differentiation, association, and connection. Okay, so now that we're clear about what exactly we're trying to do here, here are the six essential elements of a brand's identity. So, like I said earlier, your brand's identity is made up of different parts. It's kind of like a mosaic or a puzzle. So there are all these different parts that make up your brand. There are all these things that should come to mind when people think about your brand. So here are the six essential elements. The first is the logo. So this is usually what comes to mind when people think about your brand. It's usually the logo, but the logo is part of something much bigger. So your logo, there are different types of logos. So for example, it could be a symbol like Starbucks, or it could be a letter mark like the McDonald's M, or it could be a word mark that just has the name of the company spelled out in a unique way. So there's so many different types of logos. So ideally, the logo, it needs to work at any size. It needs to have variations. It has to work at a smaller size and also at a larger size. The second essential element is the typography. So some people see typography as boring, but typography is what makes your marketing messaging easy to read. So when people come across your typography, it's really important for your brand to have a distinct approach to typography. So by using certain types of fonts in your marketing, that would really help to build that trust because people recognize your brand. It becomes more recognizable because you're using certain types of fonts. So when we talk about typography, it's more about which kinds of fonts would make our brand more engaging, more interesting to read, and also which kinds of fonts will make our brand more recognizable. So if you look at world-class brands, they have certain types of fonts that they tend to use. So all these things would really help to make your brand much more distinct so that people identify it and recognize it. The next essential element is also what comes to mind. So that's the color scheme. So when it comes to your brand's color scheme, we're not just picking colors based on what we like or what we don't like. So we're picking colors based on how we want people to feel about our brand or how we want customers to perceive us because different colors have different associations. Different colors have different meanings. So it's really important to be very strategic in when you're choosing the right colors because we want people to feel a certain way, to perceive our brand in a certain way. So it's more about being more strategic in how we approach colors. And also, the way you approach colors online is different from how you approach it offline. So a color might look different offline in print versus online on your website. So it's really important to understand these differences because sometimes your brand might look different, when it's printed versus when it's on the screen. So some brands they use Pantone colors. These are colors that are like universally accepted, so by using Pantone colors, that will help to keep your colors more consistent across different channels. Okay, another essential element is the personality. So what are the personality traits that our customers would love the most about our brand? What personality traits make our brand more unique, more distinct? Because ultimately, we're trying to really connect with people. So the brand, it needs to have certain traits that make it distinct, that make it appealing. It needs to have certain traits. The next is the tone of voice. So the tone of voice is more focused on, so for example, when people read our marketing message, how do we want to come off when people read our marketing message, when they read our blogs, when they read our advertisements? How would we describe the tone? So for example, do we want to be more colloquial to speak to younger audiences, or do we want to sound more nostalgic to speak to older audiences? Or do we want to just keep it blunt? So these are all examples of tone of voice. So when people read our copy, it creates a certain impression about who we are as a company. So when we look at our target audience, that would help to determine the right tone that would really speak to them, that would appeal to them. So you might also consider, like, so for example, when you look at your target customers, they may have certain websites that they like, certain blogs, certain magazines, certain podcasts. All these things would give us a better idea of how we could, the kind of tones that would be most appealing to them, how they like to communicate. And lastly, we have imagery. So imagery is rarely used, but it's a really powerful part of your brand's identity. It's just as powerful as the logo. So when we talk about your brand's imagery, we're talking about what kinds of images should come to mind when people think about our brand. How can we use photography more effectively? So at this point, it's more about using design. So we're trying to use design more strategically to draw attention, to drive people to take action, to really create that connection with our customers. So in terms of your brand's imagery, everything has to work together. So for example, your imagery, it needs to work with the color scheme. So we need to use images that complements the color scheme or images that match the color scheme. That would really help to make our marketing more effective. So you can see this as a mosaic. So you have all these different parts, and all these different elements are working together to create to create an experience, to create the right impression about who you are as a company. So these are the six essential elements. Okay. So, for example, do you want to be more luxurious, or do you want to be more bold, or you just want to be more fun? So, all these things need to be expressed through the logo, through your color scheme, through the kinds of pictures that you're using. Because ultimately, we're just trying to create the right image so that so we're just considering like how do we want to be perceived when people come across our brand? So these are the six essential elements: the logo, the typography, the color scheme, the personality, the tone of voice, and the imagery. Okay, so here's some other elements that can also be included. Okay. Another element could be the iconography. So icons are rarely used, but that's another effective way to make your marketing more effective. So with iconography, you're able to take very complicated concepts and communicate them in a simplified way. So we're just thinking of how can we leverage design to make our brand easier to understand, easier to remember. So iconography, it could also be called symbolism. So it could be used on your websites, it could be used on your marketing materials. It could also be used for Instagram stories. Another essential element is illustration. So by using illustration, that's another way to make the brand much more distinct, much more recognizable, to really connect with people. So illustration it can actually be more effective than photography because with illustration, there's no limits to what you can communicate. But with photography, you can only convey things that exist in the outside world. But with illustration, you can communicate anything pretty much. You could even have your own character, your own brand character that goes on your marketing materials. That would really help to make the brand much more distinct. Okay, another element that's rarely used is patterns. So people rarely use patterns, but patterns are actually very powerful because studies have shown that our brains love patterns. So we actually love patterns. So by incorporating patterns into your brand's identity, that would really help to make it much more memorable because they keep seeing the patterns over and over. So it will make the brand much more memorable and also much more visually appealing. So patterns are very, very common in the luxury industry. So you're probably familiar with the Burberry pattern or the Gucci pattern. So a lot of luxury brands they incorporate patterns, but patterns can be used in any industry. Anyone can incorporate patterns to make their brand much more recognizable. Okay, another essential element that can be included is the geometry. So, especially if you're like a tech company or you want to come off as more innovative, you could incorporate geometry into your brand's identity to make it much more distinct, make it much more dynamic, much more modern. So one example is Hewlett Packard or HP. So HP incorporates angle into your brand's identity. So if you look at their marketing materials, they tend to have things at a certain angle. They even have their logo at a certain angle. So by incorporating angle into their brand's identity, that really helps to make the brand much more distinct, much more recognizable, much more dynamic. You could also incorporate geometric shapes. So brands like Big Commerce, they incorporate geometric shapes into their brand's identity. So all these things make it stand out more as more distinct, more innovative. And other essential elements can be textures. So you could also incorporate textures. This is also rarely used, but you can incorporate textures into your brand's identity. So the thing about textures is that if you don't incorporate textures, then sometimes your brand can come off as very flat. So by incorporating texture, you can communicate a certain feel. So let's say, for example, you're trying to communicate comfort, warmth. In that case, then you might incorporate very soft textures. And also, for example, let's say you're trying to communicate durability, strength, then you might incorporate hard textures like wood or metallic textures. So in psychology, we call this multi-sensory integration. So by incorporating textures, you could trigger the other senses. So they don't just see your brand, but they also feel it in their minds. They also feel your brand in their mind. So let's say, for example, your local restaurants, by really emphasizing the texture of the food, that would really help to make it much more distinct, much more appealing. So textures are a really powerful tool. And lastly, we have audio. So this is what I mentioned earlier when I spoke about audio branding. So you could actually incorporate audio into your brand to make it much more distinct. So when we talk about audio branding, we're saying like what sounds should come to mind when people think about your brand. So for example, if any of you have a MacBook, if you've ever opened the MacBook, the sound that you hear, that's an example of audio branding. Or if you turn on a Droid phone, the sound that you hear, that's an example of audio branding. So these are all just ways for people to identify who they are. So when you hear the sound, you already know that that's a MacBook, or you already know that that's a Droid, or maybe the whistle of McDonald's, or you've probably heard maybe it's Maybelline. These are all examples of audio. So there are different ways to approach audio. So for example, you might buy a sound online, or you can get it for free. It's a pretty low cost. But the thing is, if it's a low cost or free, then other people might use the same thing. But if you want something more unique, then you might need to purchase it at a higher cost, or you might need to hire someone who makes beats or like an audio engineer who can create a distinct sound for your brand that can go on all your advertisements. So as you can see, our brand is much broader than just the logo. So it's more about incorporating all these different elements together to really create an experience. So they don't just see the brand, but they also feel it. They can hear it. So it becomes much more distinct. It becomes much more unique because ultimately we're trying to stand out from the others and we're trying to really create that emotional connection. So by looking at all these different elements, it should really inspire you to think much more broadly about your brand. So how can we leverage photography more effectively to draw attention? How can we leverage colors more effectively to really draw people in? How can we incorporate patterns to make our brand much more distinct, much more recognizable? So these are all just ways to enhance your brand's design. Okay, so now that we've looked at all the different elements, here are some examples of effective visual branding. So one example is by CVS Health. So CVS, they actually rebranded around 2016. And ever since they rebranded, it really helped to enhance their brand's image. So one thing about the CVS rebrand is that they didn't change completely. They preserved the things that customers love the most, that customers used to recognize them. The reason why I chose CVS is because a lot of people on this call are in the healthcare industry. So this is a good example of healthcare branding. So you can see how they kept the word mark the way it's written, but they incorporated a heart into the logo. So that really helps to create that emotional connection because everyone can recognize what a heart is. Everyone can remember what a heart is. But the thing about your heart symbol is how it's rendered. So it's rendered in a very unique way. It's a very distinct style of rendering. And another thing about your heart symbol is that it works well with photography. So if you're looking for an effective example of healthcare branding, then CVS Health is a really good example. So if you go to their stores, you will see how their heart symbol is incorporated with photography. Notice how they use certain types of images, very bright, very warm, and they incorporate that with the symbol. So all these things really help to emphasize the brand and really create that emotional connection. So by incorporating your logo with photography, that could really help to make it much more dynamic so that you can connect with people at a much more emotional level. They also incorporate iconography into the symbol. So they use different icons. So all these things work together to tell a story in their marketing materials. And notice the bright red colors that really help to draw attention. And the color red is deeply associated with health. So that's what they're all about, is helping people on the path to better health. So all these different elements work together to shape the perception, to shape the experience. When you walk into their store, when you browse their website, you would see these elements everywhere. So all these things help to create the right perception of who they are as a company. Okay, so here's another effective example of visual branding. So this is in the financial industry. So like I said earlier, your brand is not just about the logo. Your photography, your approach to photography is also very important. So one brand that uses photography very effectively is American Express. So they use photography very effectively. So notice how we're not just picking pictures based on what we like. We're thinking of how can we use photography much more effectively to really connect with our customers and draw people in to create that interest. So this is all just an example of clever advertising, clever marketing. So if you look at their photography, you would see that they tend to use images that have two people interacting because they want people to perceive their brand as something that you could use when you're out with your friends. So when you're out with your friends, you can use your American Express card. So that really helps to make it more appealing. So they use images that show two people or people coming together to have fun. Another thing about their images is that they tend to use natural lighting. So they don't use these fake images with lots of filters. They like to use natural images with bright, clean lighting. Another thing about their images is that they aim for images that are very diverse. So they like to have people of all races, all backgrounds into their images. Another thing about their images is that they like to avoid images that look too busy. So they avoid images that look too busy and they aim for a clean background so that they can place text on it because, like I said, everything needs to work together. So your images, it needs to work well with your text. It needs to work well with your color scheme. Everything works together very nicely. Notice how they incorporate their debit card onto the photography. So this is all just an example of clever advertising. So they incorporate their debit card into the photography to make it much more visually engaging, much more interesting, so that it tells a story of who they are. So these are all just examples of effective visual branding, both in the healthcare industry and in the financial sector. Okay, so now that we've developed a world-class brand, the next step is to develop your marketing materials. So after you've gained more clarity on your visual identity, you can now develop a set of guidelines. So your brand's guidelines is kind of like a document that really clarifies how your brand approaches design because you might have different people creating marketing, creating graphics. So it's really important to have a set of guidelines that anyone can use so that way you can keep everything consistent. So your brand guidelines is also called your brand book or your style guide, but it would really provide people with information on who you are and how you want to approach design so that way anyone who reads it would know exactly what to do, the kinds of business cards to create, the kind of website you're looking for. So one example of a marketing collateral could be your business cards. So the goal of a business card is not to persuade, it's not to persuade people. The goal of the business card is for follow-up. So let's say, for example, you meet someone at a networking event. You can now give that person your business card so that they could follow up with you later. So if you're giving your business card to people who aren't interested, then you're going to end up wasting lots of printing dollars. So ideally, we need to give our business cards to people who have already shown interest so that they can follow up with us later. Because I heard people saying that business cards don't work, but they actually do. But you just have to give them to people who have already expressed interest. So ideally, your business card, it needs to be consistent with your brand. So it also needs to be of good quality. So we have to avoid business cards that are very flimsy. Let's try to have business cards that are very, really good. It has to be good quality paper so that way it doesn't keep folding and crumpling. It has to be good quality paper. You could also incorporate textures onto the business card or like an extra glow onto it so that it really pops more, an extra gloss. Another example is your brochures. So you could have a bifold brochure, a trifold, or even a tetrafold that has four sides. So your brochures will just give people a better idea of what your company is all about, so that they can now take the action that you want them to take, whether you want them to buy now or sign up or donate. So all these would be outlined. So the challenge of a brochure is that it has to balance both text and pictures, because if your brochures have too much text, then it's going to be very boring. So you have to balance text and pictures in an effective way. And it has to be consistent with our brand as well. Next is proposals. So especially if you're in B2B, so by having very well designed proposals, that could also help you to grow, to close more business. So it's really important to have well designed proposals that are consistent with your brand and your look and feel. Okay, another example is your postcard. So some people think direct mail is dead, but it just depends on the kind of business you have. So let's say, for example, you're trying to reach people of a certain demographic, a certain region. In that case, then you could use a direct mail campaign to reach those people in a specific neighborhood or community. Another example could be your newsletters. So a lot of people don't use email marketing, but email marketing is actually very effective and it has a higher reach than social media. So you can start developing your newsletter templates so that you can now begin your outreach. But before you develop your newsletters, it's really important to have your lead magnets. So lead magnets, they're a form of marketing materials, but they're designed to attract your ideal prospects. So lead magnets are usually like a PDF that you can offer from a website or a landing page in exchange for email addresses. So you're offering value to your customers for free in exchange for email addresses. So by offering lead magnets, that would really help you to grow your email list over time so that you can follow up with these prospects and reach out to these prospects. So there's so many different examples of marketing materials, but these are just some examples that you can start with. And lastly, presentations. Let's say, for example, you plan to speak at events. In that case, you can also develop some presentations and just have them available for the final events date. Okay. So what kinds of marketing materials do you think would be most effective when you're trying to reach your ideal customers, whether it's online or offline? What marketing materials should you be considering? Well, it all just depends on your kind of business and also the kind of customers you're trying to reach. Okay, so here are the benefits of having a distinctive brand identity. So when you have a very distinct brand identity that's well thought out, you personally you feel proud of it. You feel proud of how your company looks and how it's you feel like everything is looks much better. And your stakeholders are also proud. Your employees are proud of it because it looks much better. It also really helps to improve efficiency in your marketing. So when you have a well-designed brand identity, you have a really effective approach to photography, to messaging, to color. All these things help to improve your marketing metrics, and also it helps to improve efficiency because sometimes you might be outsourcing your marketing to different people. So by having a clearly defined brand identity, then you can now outsource your marketing to different people because you have a clear picture of how you want your brand to be perceived. You have a clear picture of the creative direction. So it's you could see it as an extension of your marketing plan. So it's just a plan of how you're going to approach design more effectively before you begin marketing. Okay. Also, as your brand evolves, your company also needs to evolve. So as your company grows over time, your brand's identity also needs to evolve so that it stays fresh, stays relevant. So it's an ongoing process. So these are three benefits for businesses. But what about from the customer's point of view? So from the customer's point of view, it really helps to reflect your integrity, your commitment. So your brand's identity, it needs to reflect the quality of your work. It needs to have a really effective approach to design that reflects your commitment, your integrity, the quality of your offers. It needs to have that professionalism. It also really helps you to build a brand because over time you have to build a brand. So it has to look trustworthy. It has to look credible. And lastly, when you have a well thought out brand identity, that really helps you to draw more attention. So by having an effective approach to design, to messaging, that will really help to draw more attention to your brand and improve engagement. So these are all the benefits of having a very distinct brand identity. So after we get off this call, I encourage you to really rethink your business and think of how can you leverage design more effectively to draw more attention to what you have to offer, to create more engagement, more interest. Okay. And how can you think much more broadly about your brand? Because it's not just about the logo, it's about how all these different pieces come together to create the right perception, the right experience. Okay. So I really hope you found this presentation informative. Let's go into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put your hands up in the chat and I'll be happy to answer.